Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to the episode of Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want to paint stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, we'll show you how to save money on your miniatures painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And now in today's video, we're going to show you guys how to paint a Forge World exclusive miniature, which is the Ashwood Stranger, the bounty hunting former Paladin Enforcer Dramatis Personae character that you can recruit in your gangs for your campaigns of Necromunda. And as you can see in this image, this is the end result that we have. We brought this miniature to a beautiful tabletop standard, and by using the materials that we suggest with our Cheapskate method, we're going to help you save $157.66 with an initial investment of $35.08 for painting up this miniature. So we're going to talk about exactly how we paint this miniature to this quality by using some cheap craft materials. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing you have to do, of course, is to assemble your miniature. It is a Forge World exclusive miniature, so that part is pretty simple. You just follow the assembly instructions to make the miniature. The next thing you have to do, of course, is add texturing to the base, and for this technique, I like to use wood glue as well as sand in order to create this kind of rough texture that you see that the Ashwood Stranger is standing on. It's a pretty simple method. All I really do is I just kind of paint the base with some wood glue that I have from my garage. I dust it with some sand that I get from my backyard and let it dry. And once that texturing is dried, in order to make sure that it doesn't come flaking off the base, what I do is I make a 50-50 mixture into a slurry. It is a 50-50 mixture of wood glue and water that I apply like a wash all over the texturing and let it dry overnight, so that way it stays hard and at the same time it doesn't flake off the base. The very last step you have to do, of course, is to prime your miniatures, and that's kind of an important step in miniature war painting, and the reason why is because the primer does a couple of things. The first thing it does, it helps your acrylic paints to adhere to your surface of your miniature, and the reason why is because the slightest bit of friction will cause the paint to rub off of it, which could ruin the overall finish of your miniature. Another reason why priming is so important as well is because the color of primer that you use, tends to have a pretty effective, pretty critical effect on the overall vibrancy of the color of your miniatures as well. Since we're doing an oil wash in this miniature at the end of it, which is a quick paint method, it's going to darken down the value of the colors that we use. So we're going to use a white primer so that way it doesn't take away from the vibrancy of the colors that we put on this miniature. So after spraying with some cheap Rust-Oleum flat white primer that I get at my local Walmart, the next thing we're going to do, of course, is to base coat the miniature, especially with the flesh. Now, the flesh on this is actually quite minimal. It's just a partial of the face of the Ashwood Stranger. Half his face is kind of hidden by this respirator that he's wearing, as well as his hands. And that part is really simple. All we got to do is just base coat 2 thin layers of avocado flesh. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's really cheap stuff. Just put 2 thin layers directly onto it, and then we're ready to move on to our first highlighting using dry brushing. Now, the color I like to use is Delta Ceram Coats Peaches and Cream. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 67 cents. It's really cheap stuff, but the nice thing about this though is that I use this as a dry brush for the flesh that we did earlier. Now, dry brushing is an important step in miniatures painting because what it does, it allows creates an illusion of depth in your miniature by letting the pigments of the actual paint to adhere to the raised surfaces of your miniature. What you do is when you dry brush your miniature with this lighter color, the darker flesh color stays in the recesses of the miniature while the lighter color adheres to the recess to the raised surfaces, and that kind of creates this illusion of depth in your miniature as well. It creates some highlighting in addition to that. Now, there is a bit of a drawback because you do have this kind of chalky pastel appearance of the miniature. That's perfectly fine. That is all part of the process, and when we get to the oil washing stage, that's going to fix a lot of those problems. So now that the flesh is over with, we're going to start painting up this miniature. Now, we're going to pretty much follow the same kind of guidelines that the miniature actually shows at the box set. The Ashwood Stranger has kind of like this black kind of undersuit with like brown fabric that he wears, kind of like a poncho as well as a cape. He also wears white colored armor. So we're going to use that same exact color scheme that's on the packaging material from this miniature. So to get the undersuit as well as the boots that this character is wearing, we're going to pick that out 2 thin layers of pigment paint. You can get this at your local Walmart from Apple Barrel. It costs about 54 cents. It's a wonderfully dark gray, almost to a point where it's black, and plus a little bit of a grit texture to it, so when you do dry brushing, it does a really good job of capturing those pigments. So we're just going to put 2 thin base coats directly on all the parts of the undersuit, so like the sleeves that he's wearing for his shirt, as well as for the boots that he's wearing as well. You don't need to be particularly neat at this stage. All you gotta do is make sure you got a good solid base coat to work off of, and we're gonna move on to our next detail. So next detail we're going to work on real fast is on the other types of clothing this character is wearing. So this Ashwood trader is kind of like wearing like this kind of tunic over his old uniform. So to get that color, we're going to use Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice cheap dark brown color. I get this at my local Walmart for about 54 cents. I was going to put that on directly onto all the parts of the miniature that I want to have that brownish color for. Now he does have a cape, which we're going to highlight that in red later on. So we just kind of focus this along the wrappings around his legs. It's kind of like he's wearing like this kind of like Middle Eastern kind of caftan looking kind of coat that he's wearing, and that's the kind of the overall look we're going with. At the same time, we're also using the exact same color for the straps that's on the armor on the forearms of the character as well. You can kind of see the two little belts that's there on his left hand. So I just kind of picked those out in pigment and burnt umber as well. Now the most challenging part of this miniature to actually paint is the body armor, and the reason why that's the case is because in the original box art for this miniature, the body armor is kind of like a pale white color, and white is notoriously difficult to paint as a color. And the reason why is because white is extremely transparent, which means that any kind of dark colors that are beneath the white paint is kind of going to bleed through, so you have to put like constant layers on top of this. So to solve this problem, what I like to use is a very opaque color like granite gray, which you can get at your local Walmart for about 54 cents. And it's a very light gray, just a few tones darker than actual white, but as you can see on the miniature, based on the primer that we use, you really can't tell the difference. And I like using granite gray because what it does, it creates a nice solid base coat that I can later on neaten up and bring it to the level of brightness I want by adding successive layers of white paint on top of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this for all the armor that this character is wearing. So for example, like the chest piece that he's wearing from his enforcer body armor, as well as the gauntlets that he's also wearing, as well as the leg greaves that he has, and the respirator that's on his face. We're going to put two thin layers of this so that we have a good solid base coat that we can lean up later on as we want to. So next detail we're going to catch now are some finer details, things like the character's hair, as well as one of the shoulder pads, as well as the chest piece that this character is wearing as well. We're going to pick this out in two thin layers of King's Gold. Once again, you can get this at your local Walmart for about 54 cents. And we're going to use it directly onto the hair of the character, as well as that shoulder armor, as well as the chest piece. Now the reason why we're using this color is because on the box art, it looks like one of the shoulder pads that the character is wearing has been replaced with like a highway sign. And so it's like a scrap piece of metal that he's used to kind of do a hasty repair on his armor. So we're going to use that. At the same time, the little circle in the middle of his armor, of course, is a classic look from the Paladin Enforcers, so we're going to use that look as well. And then of course just go with two thin layers of this and we're ready to move on to our next step. The next little detail we're going to work on is on the sword that this character is carrying. He actually carries an Ashwaste Nomad long blade on his back, so it looks like this kind of like curved shamsir looking kind of sword. It looks really neat, kind of reminds me of a Chinese Dao is what it kind of looks like. So to pick out that detail, we're going to actually paint that in some Anita's acrylic true red. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for I think about $1.20, I think is what it costs now. And the reason why I like this is because that bright red is going to contrast nicely against the browns as well as the blacks that we're using, as well as the white color of his armor, because there's a lot of earth tones in this miniature, so that bright is going to be very eye-catching as well. I have a sneaky suspicion that narratively speaking this sword has some kind of significance, but it is really cool looking, so we're just going to put two thin layers in the grip as well as the scabbard on his back. So next color we're going to start working on is on some of the leather goods on this miniature as well. Now the nice thing about this character, he's got a lot of leather goods in terms of like wrapping and cording around his wrists, as well as the cape that he has on his back. Same thing with some of the belts that are crisscrossing his body, some of the ammo pouches that he has as well. So in order to bring out those details and make them eye-catching, we're going to use Territorial Beige or Apple Barrel Paint. Once again, a very cheap kind of pale brown color you can get at your local Walmart. And just put two thin layers on that color on all the parts that we want. So things like the belts, for example, and other leather goods that this character is wearing. If you also notice, I also decided to use that on the leather straps on his left forearm, just because the burnt umber was a nice touch, but it just kind of blended too closely to the black in my opinion, so I want to bring that detail out a little bit. So I just put two thin layers of that Territorial Beige. So in this photo, I basically took the miniature and turned it 180, so that way you can see exactly the leather details that's on the back of the character as well. We're continuing on with that Territorial Beige for the leather straps along his back, as well as some of the ammo pouches along his hips, as well as the little cape that he has hanging off of his sword as well. And another detail we're going to pick out real quick is the wrapping around the scabbard itself of the weapon. The weapon looks like it has like this kind of improvised kind of wrapping around it, because maybe it's got holes in it or got torn or something like that. So to pick out that detail so that way it contrasts nicely with the red and doesn't get lost in the other browns that we're using on this miniature, we use khaki by Apple Barrel Paint. Once again, this is a 54-cent tube of paint that you get at your local Walmart. Just put two thin layers directly onto that bandaging on his scabbard and ready to move on to our next detail. So, just a little bit of a spoiler alert, my gaming group and I are actually planning on doing a very large campaign that we're really excited to put together, and one of our campaigns we're planning on using Bad Zone Enforcers in that campaign. And one of the details that one of my friends wanted to have for their gang is that they wanted to make it look like the Ashwood Strangers would lead that Bad Zone Enforcer gang, and at the same time have like this kind of desert camouflage pattern on the cloaks that these characters are wearing, so that way they can kind of signify these guys as being different than their normal Paladin Enforcer counterparts. This Bad Zone Enforcer gang is supposed to be operating exclusively in the ash wastes. So to create that kind of desert camouflage, we're going to use some taupe gray by Adidas acrylic. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about $1.20, and we're going to pick some little camouflage kind of patterns on the cape that this character is wearing, like the poncho he's wearing. You really can't see it too well on this picture, but when I turn the miniature over around so you can see a better splotching color, it's going to look very obvious about the kind of like camo pattern we're going with. So if you turn the miniature 180 degrees, you can see like the little color blobs that I have of Adidas Acrylic's taupe gray in order to create that camouflage pattern. Just to be perfectly honest with you guys, the camouflage pattern I'm going with is a traditional desert type camouflage, and it's kind of based on the old 1990s US Army chocolate chip style desert camo. If you guys ever seen that, basically it looks like your typical desert camo, but there's like these little black splotches on top of it as well, and people call it the chocolate chip look because it kind of looked like a chocolate chip cookie. This is from the era when the Desert Storm was actually going on. So that's the kind of color scheme I'm going to go with. So now we're going to add some darker colors directly onto the camouflage. We're once again using Burnt Umber by Apple Pearl Paint. We're just going to put two thin layers to make some of those kind of color blobs, camouflage-like patterns to create that desert camo, and that's going to be the interior of his cape. And here's the 180 degree viewpoint from the behind, so you can see I made some little dark little splotches using that Burnt Umber color to kind of create that look. And the very last detail we're going to add now is the little chocolate chip part. I'm just going to put little dashes and dots of pigment paint directly onto the camouflage pattern to make it look like it has that traditional desert camouflage look that you would wear out in the deserts. And once again, here's a better close-up of that. As you can see, the little black little splotches that I put directly onto the camouflage, it can make it look like that old school desert camouflage kind of chocolate chip pattern. Now, if you notice this entire process, we really haven't done any dry brushing for the miniature yet, and the reason why is because we use one single color to do the overall dry brushing on the miniature, and that color, of course, is Granite Gray by Apple Pearl Paint. We're just going to do a quick dry brushing directly all over the entirety of the miniature, so the face, the flesh, the uniform that the characters wear, and the clothing, the weapons that they actually have. And the reason why we're doing that is to make it look like the clothing is kind of faded, kind of weathered and worn, and it's got like this kind of like grayish grime on it from being out in the ash wastes. And here's a close-up of the back so you can see exactly the same kind of brushing we did directly onto the cloak the character's wearing, as well as all the leather goods that they have as well. So the next detail we're going to work on now is on the metallic elements of this miniature, and there's actually quite a bit of it. So the very first color we're going to use is Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. It's a beautiful gunmetal color and does a beautiful job on the miniatures as well. At the same time, it's extremely cheap, and I love using this color. So we're going to paint things like, for example, the gun barrels of the customized stub gun on the character's left hand, their customized auto gun on the right, auto pistol on the right hand, and same thing with like the tube that's going out their abdomen directly to that water tank looking thing that's hanging off his belt. And we're just going to put those in two thin layers of gunmetal gray. And we're going to use the exact same color as well as on little charms. If you look on the scabbard the character is carrying for their sword, they got these like little charms like hanging off of it. So we're going to pick those out in two thin layers of gunmetal gray as well. The next color we're going to focus on is Folk Art's Copper. Once again, getting this at our Walmart for about 75 cents. And we're going to use this for all the copper details that we want on the miniature. So for example, like that little oxygen tank looking thing that's connected to his hip, we're using that, as well as some of the weapon attachments on his auto pistol, as well as his customized stub gun, so that we can bring those details and kind of give them their own little color, so that way your eye is drawn to those details. And the very last metallic element we're going to focus on is on Emperor's Gold by Deco Art. I get this at my local Walmart for about 75 cents as well. And we're going to do this with all the gold elements that we want. So things like on the faceplate the character's wearing, so the respirator he has, something like a little like circuitry on his ear. We're also going to use this on some of the bullets that you see in the bandolier that he wears as well as the sword scabbard that's on his back. So for the sword on his back, we're going to use that Deco Arts Emperor's Gold on the pommel of the sword, as well as the hilt as well. And we're just going to put two thin layers of that directly onto those weapons, and maybe some of the metallic elements on the guns, just to bring a little bit more, visual interest to those weapons. And the next little detail we're going to focus on real quick is on the little photolumen that's on his shoulder. We're just going to put a little two thin dots of kiwi paint directly onto the lens of that little photolumen to make it look like it's glowing in the dark, and he uses it in the ash wastes. So now that we're done painting the miniature itself, the next thing we're going to work on is on the base. And so for the base, we're going to do our typical wasteland base that we use for pretty much a lot of the miniatures that we have in the studio's collection. What we're going to do is we're going to paint the texturing of the base in 2 thin layers of pigment paint real quick. So if you can see that after we apply that paint on there, if you notice that white undercolor is actually bleeding through the pigment paint, and that's perfectly fine. And the reason why is because we're going to dry brush this anyways with pale gray. So if there's any white that's peeking through from the pigment that we put on this thing, it's just going to look like it's part of the dry brushing. And once again, I'm just going to do a quick dry brush real quick with some granite gray directly onto the base and the texturing, so that way we have that darker pigment color in the recesses of the base, while that granite gray is catching the raised surfaces, creating that illusion of depth. Alright, so the next step is going to be an oil wash. We only do one type of wash for this miniature, is an oil wash. And what we like to use, of course, is Minwax polyacrylic and mission oak. And what you're going to do is you're going to apply this like a wash all over the entirety of the miniature, and you're going to let this dry and cure for about 24 hours. Now, the reason why we're going to do this as the very last step for miniature is because the oil wash does a couple of things. The first thing the oil wash does is that it seeps directly into the recesses of the miniature and brings out a lot of those details we couldn't see before, like the texturing on the base, for example, the gaps in his armor panel, the spaces between his fingers, the musculature, all the different textures that this miniature has, and it's going to lead that darker color directly into the recesses and make those details pop. The second thing that the oil wash also does too is it smooths out the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating. And as you can see, that kind of pastel kind of chalky look is now gone by the wayside, completely gone, and the reason why is because it smooths out those transitions between our dry brushes and our base coats. And the last thing it does too, it also mutes down the vibrancy of our colors. That's the reason why we use such bright colors in the earlier parts of the painting process, because this oil wash is going to darken those values down. Now you do have to let this stuff dry and cure for about 24 hours because it is a wood stain, and at the same time it also has some polyurethane inside of it, so it's going to have a nice kind of like harder outer shell to kind of protect everything. It's going to dry in a high gloss finish, so if you don't like that high gloss finish, you got to do some kind of varnish spray to kind of fix that, so just do keep that in mind. Now I like using Minwax polyacrylic because it costs $6.99 at my local Walmart. It does exactly the same thing in my opinion as Army Painter Strong Tone, except that Army Painter Strong Tone costs like $35+ here in the United States, whereas the Minwax polyacrylic is very, very cheap, about 1/5 of the cost, and that's the reason why I like using this. So like I said, you have to wait for this stuff to dry to cure for about 24 hours, so I would use this as the very last step of your painting process, wait a day, and then come back and pick off where you left off. Alright, the next thing we're going to do real quick is we waited 24 hours. Now we're going to ruin the base of the miniature. We're going to pick down 2 thin coats of Skyline by Folk Art. I get this at my local Walmart, at my local Hobby Lobby for about, Walmart actually, for about 75 cents. It's a nice grayish, bluish color, and I like using this color for all these skirmish miniatures in the studio's collection. I like using it for our Mordheim miniatures as well as for our Necromunda miniatures because it looks like it's part of like this urban look, like it's fighting in like decayed urban areas. And that's the reason why I like using it. Just put 2 thin coats directly on the rim of the base, and we're ready to move on to our varnish. Now this last step is completely optional, but I like to have a matte finish on my miniatures just because I don't like that high gloss sheen on the polyacrylic. So I just take some matte varnish from some Crown matte varnish that I get at my local Walmart for about $6.99. I just spray it all over the miniature real quick so that way it has a nice muted finish. And it's very matte, and as you can see, it brings a lot of those details we couldn't see from the high gloss, and that pretty much finishes up our miniature. So once again, this is the end result of our cheapskate method using some treat craft paste that we get from both Hobby Lobby as well as Walmart, and we're talking about a grand total investment of $35.08, assuming of course you're purchasing everything for the very first time from the cheapskate method that we just talked about earlier. So now that we're done showing you our cheapskate method and how we painted this miniature to a beautiful tabletop standard, let's talk about exactly what materials you need to buy from Army Painter as well as from Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. So these are the colors you need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same result we did. And by the way, here's the background image. You can see what our Bad Zone Enforcer gang is going to look like for an upcoming campaign that we have. Alright, so you got to buy some Corax White Spray for $24, as well as the colors Averland Sunset, Cadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Ulthuan Gray, Moot Green, Eshin Gray, Flayed One Flesh, Mephiston Red, Rakarth Flesh, as well as Rust Gray, and all those colors are going to cost you $4.55 per pot. You also need to buy the colors Wildwood, Leadbelcher, Screaming Bell, Retributor Armor, and each of those costs $7.80 for those. You'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, as well as a can of Munitorium Varnish for $24, an Army Painter Basing Set for $18.09, as well as some Citadel PVA glue for $12.50. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything on this list for the very first time, we're talking about a grand total investment of $192.74 to paint this one single miniature. Now, when you compare that to the cheapskate method, $35.08, and you subtract 2, you end up with a grand total savings of $157.66. So there you guys have it. If you're looking for a way to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching to cheaper craft paints. After all, you get similar results at a fraction of the price, and of course you can use that money for whatever you like. And since especially here in the United States we're living through some pretty inflationary times over here, making every dollar count is pretty important to have for your hobby. So there you guys have it. This is what you guys think of our overall product. Do you like the overall finish? What things would you change, or how would you paint up your Ashwood Strangers? If you decide to make some differences, please put it down in the comments. I'd love to see exactly what your guys' feedback is on this miniature. So that's good for this week, guys. As always, please feel to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. I am Commander Cheapskate. I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace out and stay classy.